Once there was a young lady who went by the name of Ava, who went by every road a woman shouldn't, because her name meant life, and she meant to live it. Now that sounds brave, but she didn't start off so bold. Her family had fled the pogroms in Russia, and they'd brought with them dark stories of disloyalty at the hands of men who could kill you with their smiles. And so, it's fair to say that Ava grew up with an ingrained mistrust of that domineering sex. But it's also fair to say that those stories gave her something good too, a sense of wonder about far-off places and adventure and near escapes. Of course, having survived their ordeal in Russia, Ava's parents, or so it seemed to her, were set on repopulating the earth with their heavenly offspring. She was the 8th of 9 children. And having so many children, the parents had to work so hard. Father is a barber, always boasting about how he started off sweeping floors for 60 pence, and mother working with Ava's aunt and grandmother in their front room hair salon. And as they worked so hard, the children were left to their own devices, so that, being the youngest for a long time, Ava often bore the brunt of her brother's boredom, like when they would lower her slowly over a gorse bush, which, as you can imagine, did not help with her thorny issue about boys. A problem that was only compounded when she was sent off to a posh boarding school for girls, where all the teachers were women, and every one of them bitter about the fiancés that they'd lost in the war. Some of them to guns and bombs, yes, but others to fickleness and fateful encounters with French women. Added to more stories of loss, hurt, and disloyalty at the hands of men was the rule that the girls were forbidden from even speaking with boys, so that Ava became a young lady who was quite nervous around the male species. And yet there was one particular lad who went by the name of Adam who was different. He was different from Ava because where she had gone to the sea only when she was 12 and stayed in her grandmother's caravan, he'd gone with his brother every single year in his grandfather's open-top Bentley and sometimes the Sunbeam. Where Ava lived in a dead-end street in Bristol, Adam's dad got together with Charles Talbot and bought Bewdley Hill House with its big old plane tree in the middle of the extensive gardens, the run of which Adam and his brother had all throughout the war. While Ava felt the meagerness of rations, excited over the chance of buying 2 loaves of bread when they were over, Adam was eating sweets and playing totopoly with his brother in his grandfather's new house on Chester Road North in Kidderminster, blissfully unaware that they had never been in want. Yet, in a wardrobe in that house when it was first bought, Adam found a perfectly good set of woods, which lent to the fact that, while he was different from Ava in many ways, he was different from other boys. Where other lads were listening to rock and roll, he loved opera. And where they, like his father who played goalie for the Kitty Harriers, loved football, Adam and his brother loved bowling. In fact, they didn't just love it, they were good at it. But good wasn't good enough for his dad. An excellent bowler himself, he often said, "Only perfect is good enough." And it paid off, because in his very first competitive match, Adam won the title. This was the way with their father. He believed in thorough, hard work, always boasting about how he'd worked all his life as a cabinet maker, right until he got rheumatism. And even then, he'd finished his last job making the counters for Stourbridge Library. It followed then that even though Adam's family had plenty of contacts and money to spare, he still had to find a trade, which, living in Kidderminster, was an obvious choice. He got his first job at Carpet Trades on Mill Street. It wasn't long, though, before he had to fulfill another obligation which all the men of the country had to fulfill: national service. He had to spend 2 years in the Navy. At the time, Ava was happily finishing her exams in piano and clarinet, singing with an all-women's choir, and working as the troop leader for Girl Guides, national service in its own right. And there was adventure in Girl Guides, and she was enjoying these things, but she longed for more. Those stories, as you recall, had filled her with the most unwomanly desire to see the world. And in keeping with her character, she wasn't going to let a man show her. She was going to see it herself, in her own plane no less. Such an endeavour, she was well aware, required money, which meant that after avoiding it for such a long time, she would have to enter the world of men. After her choir sang the Messiah at Fairfield, a few days later, she went to her first job in Kidderminster, working in the office at Gilt Edge Carpet Factory. Adam had finished his service by then and returned to the carpet trade to work at Gilt Edge too, which, as you might have guessed, is where he met Ava. She'd been sent to the shop floor to speak to him, and as she battled with reading his lips as everyone had to do in the noise of the machines, found himself thinking he'd like to do more than read those lips. Ava was not in the slightest interested in men. She was following her dream, learning to fly. This was no small feat, even though women in the war had been allowed to fly planes between airfields in the 10 years or so since. Not one woman had been allowed her civilian license. So, sticking to their role, the instructors did their utmost to make sure that she and the indomitable woman she was training with did not get their wings. Eventually, it began to wear her down. "I'm just about ready to give up," she said to her mom and aunt and gran at the front room salon. "Men are insufferable. One of them even proposed to me up there. I'm sure he did it just to distract me." "And what did you say?" asked her mum. "I told him flat out no, that I'd crash the plane if he ever brought it up again." "Good girl," said mom and aunt and gran at the same time. But then Ava was crying. "I don't think they're going to let me pass anyway. The instructor, probably because I turned him down, has spread the word that I'm too difficult to teach." Just then, a well-to-do lady who was having her hair cut sat forward and said to Ava, "My darling, now why be difficult when, with just a little more effort, you could be impossible?" There was silence. And then the women all laughed together. They laughed and they laughed until their stomachs hurt, their smiles ached, and their hearts shone with happy indignation. Adam, in the meantime, had perfected his game of bowls so that he and his brother and dad shared the title. Adam's heart, however, was set only on winning Ava. That girl who the other men in the factory said was impossible. Adam liked independent women, though. His gran, after all, had been the first woman in Kidderminster to own a bicycle, much to the vociferous outcry of her community that she would ride such an indecorous contraption. Hearing that Ava frequented the Tower Ballroom in Blackpool, Adam set off to find her. She stood out in the dress she'd made for herself. Adam, however, looked like all the other brill-creamed, brute-wearing Henry Cooper wannabes, until, that is, he took her hand. His dance lessons for the prom had paid off. He was an amazing lead. What was more for Ava was that he wasn't afraid of her independence, loving the fact that she could fly and enthusing over the opportunities that could afford her. Time and time again, he went out to join her at the ballroom and also on the factory cafeteria, where he listened to her talk about everything from making antimacassars to traveling the world. And when he talked too, there seemed nothing false inside of him, and yet those stories bubbled up inside of Ava and hardened her heart, because Adam was, after all, just a man. And so, when he finally found the courage to ask her to marry him, she said, almost instinctively, flat out, no. It was so harsh that it surprised even Ava as she looked into the tearful eyes of the man who'd become so much more than dear to her, and she knew that she'd broken his heart. Nothing mattered anymore to Adam. Not bowls, not work, not the town he called home, which just reminded him of Ava. He needed to get far away. And so, appealing to his dad's old friend Charles Talbot, he used his contacts to get a job out in Karachi, helping the Maharaja to restore his 17th century fort. Ava went down to Bristol again to find out why her heart had become so hard. The only advice that her mother could give her was, "Don't judge a sausage by its skin." And just by saying that, suddenly Ava remembered that there were other stories. Stories about good men, and how'd she forgotten those? And suddenly she knew that she loved Adam. And now it was her turn to be heartbroken. She went to his old family friend Charles Talbot, that man about town, and, quite bemusedly, he helped her charter a plane all the way to Karachi. And en route, at every stop, even though Ava was living her dream, her heart beat only for finding Adam. Now, when the Maharaja heard that a woman had flown from England all the way to Karachi by herself, in her own plane, he went out and picked her up in his own open-top jeep. Knowing that this was surely the same young lady who had broken his young British charger's heart, he asked her to wait in the jeep when they reached the fort so that he could go ahead and prepare the young lad. But the Maharaja had underestimated the pride of the men underneath his reign, who had caught wind of the fact that there was a woman riding next to their king with her hair openly flowing in the wind, and they were riding toward the fort to seek justice for this sin. Seeing those men riding towards her, with their moon-curved scimitars waving, Ava climbed out of the jeep and ran to the great door of the fort and banged on it, calling, "Help!" Adam leaned over the wall and, seeing the frantic Ava, said in his best French accent, "I'm sorry, lady. I'm just finishing my Murray mint." And then he disappeared over the wall, hopefully to open the gates. Turning to see the men riding on their camels towards her, it was all she could do not to pee in her pants to think of them singing in chorus, "Murray mince, the too good to hurry mince." And then the door was opened and she was yanked inside. She spent 2 weeks with Adam, never saying why she'd come and him never asking, until eventually she couldn't bear it any longer. And one moonlit night, out on a terrace in the fort, she got on one knee and she asked him to marry her. And he said, without hesitation, but not without kindness, "No. I'm sorry. You need to understand. This fort is almost repaired, but my heart is a long way to go." She took this with incredible grace and dignity, backing away and setting off the next morning for home, where she took up a new job teaching in a special school and trying to find solace in playing clarinet. But finding no comfort there, she went to find out whether there was anything inside of her family's past that had an answer to her, thinking that the answer might lie in taking hold fully of her family's beliefs. And that had her holidaying all the way in Israel. When Adam finally returned to Kidderminster, realizing what a fool he'd been to turn down a woman who'd flown halfway round the world to win him back, it was only to find that Ava wasn't there, and went off down to Bristol to visit those formidable women in Ava's life. And when he found them, he understood why she'd gone, and he realized, the penny dropping, "So, you're Jewish." Understanding that the family might forbid them from marrying, but Ava's mum was way ahead of him, and she said, "Don't worry, God made the crows and the nightingales. Go to her, you have our blessing." And she gave him a gold necklace to give to Ava. It bore the symbol Javier, the origins of her name, which meant life. "Give this to her. It will protect her even when you can't." Adam journeyed to find Ava, to give her this gift and his heart with it, only to find that Ava wasn't in Jerusalem anymore. He wrote to her family, finding that she'd gone on to Treblinka. And that's where he found her, mourning at the monumental grave of her people's suffering soul. Putting the necklace and his arms around her neck, he held her for as long as it took to shed all her tears and her demons with them. And when they returned, it was together, and they were healed. They soon slipped back into the rhythms of their own life, to music and teaching, to bowls and to trade, and to seeing as much of each other as they could. Ava would often take to asking Adam, "Where shall I fly you to next, sir?" because she had bought her own plane. And so, taking a map and finding a place with the rudest sounding name, he would say, "Wire Piddle," and off they'd go to drink Chateau Piddle, or "Eckle Feckin," and off they'd fly, making up their own swear words on the way. In 1966, In the most unwomanly way that Adam loved, Ava took him to see the World Cup football final. They cheered as they waited for the final whistle to be blown, and England won! They hugged, they kissed. They stopped. The world stopped. They looked at each other. The world disappeared. And then they kissed. They travelled round the world in that kiss, and when they returned to each other's eyes, they knew. Still with that kiss in his heart, Adam went down to Birmingham, to Smethwick, to find George Hook, the last mother-of-pearl worker in the Midlands, whose family had worked for 5 generations on that nacre. And with the same familial dedication, George crafted an inlaid emerald ring. Now, Adam had already got permission from Ava's mother. However, he still went down to her father to ask permission to marry him. And the father said he would agree. On one condition, he said sternly, which made Adam nervous. The condition was simply that he would get married in Whitby, and that then they'd spend the day with the rest of the family out on Robin Hood's Bay, bathed in the ancient and beautiful energies of Whitby Abbey. Adam asked Ava to marry him, and with all of her heart, she said yes. Joining the family at Robin Hood Bay later, everyone laughed watching the 2 brothers run into the freezing waters and then coming out and saying as one, "It's tingling! It's fresh as ice!" Seeing the brothers there, like twins, something broke in their father. He called them over to them and he said to them he didn't need to be their manager anymore. They were men, and they could manage themselves. The brothers looked at each other, looked at the father, and then once again as one they said, "Then we're a team." And then they laughed and they cried and they shared their joy with the rest of the family, and it was a perfect day. As was their wedding at St. Mary's in Kidderminster, where the Cookley Choir sang for them and their family and friends, including the Maharaja and of course Charles Talbot, who gave him as a honeymoon gift a trip all the way down the Amazon River, which was the first of many memories to come, including waking up at 4 a.m. together to watch the moon landing, and Adam winning the trophy of the Worcestershire Bowling Championship, and then later being named president of the Worcestershire County Indoor Bowling Association, and then having magnificent children of their own. All of them boys, but Ava didn't mind. She was okay with men now. And perhaps that was what it was all about. Many, many years later, after a 31-year campaign, standing with Charles Talbot, they opened the excellent Museum of Carpet. Standing there, watching the great old loom work away, the years rolled back, and suddenly they could see how their lives had been woven together into a beautiful and colourful carpet of memories. Adam looked at his independent wife, and she at her unconventional husband, and in the din of those great machines, he mouthed to her, "I love you," and she read his lips, and then she kissed them.